Thank you for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my ongoing reading and riffing of on Almaas's Pearl Beyond Price. So first, a little bit of housekeeping. If you are interested in circling, we have drop-in events, weekend intensives, and year-long trainings. The links for all those things are below. Also, the Circling into Dialogos course that I teach with John Vervaeke and Christopher we got another one coming up in a month or two. So if you're interested in that, link is below. And also, if you are interested in working with me one-on-one, I am currently taking clients. What you want to do is just email me and let me know that you're interested, and then we'll set up an exploratory session. Okay, let's dive in. So, basically, Almaas starts off the very first paragraph that basically says, that this wonder that we kind of come onto the planet with becomes the most familiar and conceals itself in its familiarity. And we come to, without even like consciously thinking of it or not, we start to have a understanding of ourselves that as if we know what our potential is, right? We know how we are to develop, and we pre-thematically lose ourselves in the familiarity and the dullness and the repetition of life. And implicitly, right, in that paragraph, he's identifying that problem, but he's also recognizing this possibility that perhaps you and I are more than we could even ever imagine. And that if we could somehow see through these veils of familiarity, right, that are concealed into what is most near to us, that there's a possibility of that we may be way more than we could even ever conceptualize, right? And so this is what this inquiry is about. And so he's going deep into this, the man of the spirit and the man of the world, and basically diving into it and looking at the split that's formed between the two in our understanding of it. And he's basically kind of, going deep into that. So let's go ahead and begin. Share my screen. Okay, we left off here, second paragraph. We are well aware that not all people who are interested in spiritual life consider the ultimate reality to be that of oneness or unity. The spiritual perspective covers a wide range, from the religious perspective of living a life according to divine commandments, to the spiritual one of finding a connection to a higher reality, to the mystical view of uniting with God or realizing the oneness of existence. In this study, we will focus on the second and third views as the purest expression of the man of the spirit, and we'll use them in contrast with the view of the man of the world. Which one of these we will be using at each point will be obvious from the context when not stated explicitly. So in developing or understanding of what a complete human being is, we will contrast these opposing points of view, that of the man of the world, who believes in the reality and centrality of the personal self, and that of the man of the spirit, who considers such a personal and independent self not to have any ultimate value or reality. Some might believe these perspectives are not dichotomies, that one can be a self and a person and live a personal life in a spiritual and universal way. This now I'm imagining, right, that if you're watching this video, most likely you feel that way, that there's no split or, like, in reality some deep division, right, between the personal self and that which is greater than the personal self, and think that these two things are totally possible, just like he said in that last sentence. But I think what he's addressing here, right, and what's going to be revealed is that there's a way that this dichotomy and this split is so deep in our presuppositions that split between those two and our understanding of that is that we live it out, no matter what we consciously think about it or not. That the way we comport the world, right, in some sense, has the split show up in the way we participate with reality, and so seeing this is difficult. And how I think he's getting at it is through this looking at this dialectic between the two. He goes on. This is, in fact, the perspective of most individuals who are either at the beginning of their inner journey or are among the many people who consider themselves religious. We are here using religious in contrast to spiritual. It is, furthermore, the social idea of most human societies. However, regardless of the merit or truth of this perspective, it is still not the view of some of the most advanced teachings. These teachings make it very clear that to live a true and spiritual life is to abandon self completely. In fact, many teachings assert that there is no self in any real way. The Buddhist teachings especially emphasize this no-self perspective. The Dalai Lama, the head of Tibetan Buddhism, writes, as I may as well emphasize again, the teaching of no-self is upheld by all schools of Buddhist thought, since all alike recognize the Atman view that is adhering to belief in some permanent soul entity as the root of all trouble. He goes on. Others might jump to the conclusion that maybe it is possible to live a selfless personal life. That is, to be a human person, living a true personal life of work, love, and knowledge, but without having a self. But even this hope is dashed when we inquire deeply into some of the profoundest teachings. Selflessness means egolessness, which means absence of the person. The late, see if I can say this, Nisargadatta Maharajan, that guy, one of the most profound Hindu Vedanta teachers in India, put it this way. He says, quote, "There is no such thing as a person. There are only restrictions and limitations. The sum total of these define the person. The person merely appears to be like the space within the pot appears to have the shape and volume and smell of the pot." These teachings unequivocally state that the universal truth or the impersonal spirit is just that. There is no self and no person. They are not saying necessarily that personal life is bad. What they are stating is something much more fundamental. The assertion is that there is no person or self, which negates the existence of a person who can have a personal life. According to this perspective, a personal life, i.e., the life of a person, is false. It is unreal, only an illusion. Enlightenment, then, is seen as simply seeing through this illusion. So, it's interesting because if you think about this, and Heidegger points this out in a billion different ways, that we have, in order to function at all, right? To move a finger, to look to the left, to do the most simplest thing or the most complicated thing, we presupposes that we must already always have an understanding of being as such, right? That, in other words, in order to comprehend any being or entity, I must already grasp in some way, right, and have some understanding of being itself. And that this understanding, right, is the most determinant one that sits underneath everything. So how I understand my kind of pre-thematic, inherited, historical understanding of being, right, is going to be the most determining factor in how the world shows up for me, how I relate to the world, how I see it. And that none of this needs at all operates at the level of like your frontal lobes and consciousness, right? No, it's like we live out these understandings. We find ourselves already amidst them. They govern the way the world occurs for us. And thus how we see it and perceive it is what all of our actions and our behavior is based on. That is how the world shows up for us. So I want to just keep this in mind, because this is really kind of, I think, the level at which Almaas is wanting us to kind of address and see, like that if you kind of take any part of me, right, and you take any thread and you follow it and you just keep pulling it all the way back. In other words, eventually you're going to hit ultimate reality, my assumptions about reality as such, being, right? Therefore, as difficult as it is and as tricky as it is, the more that I can, that understanding, that deep background understanding about what being is for me, my understanding of being, the world's understanding of being, the more that we can start to see it, right? Just the very seeing of it, right, is radical. And so I just want to, I think that this is where we're headed with this inquiry. All right, let's go on. Where was I? Where did I leave off? Let's see, I think these teachings unequivocally state that the universal truth or the impersonal spirit is just that. There is no self or no person. I'm sorry, I think I already read that. Okay. As we have mentioned, this is the teaching specifically of the Far East spiritual traditions, those of Buddhism, Taoism, Zen, Vedanta, and the various forms of Hinduism. In the prophetic tradition, the Hebrew, Christian, Islamic teaching, the emphasis is not on the unreality or absence of self and personality, but on negating their importance and the importance of a life based on them. We will see later on that the prophetic tradition does not give some value to personal life, but personal life is meant in a sense different from that of the man of the world. There are, of course, those who believe in the, quote, true self, unquote, or the eternal soul. But the true self is not taken usually to be personal. It is seen as infinite and boundless and impersonal. It is certainly not the personal self of the man of the world. In the case of the various teachings of Hinduism, self is equated with the impersonal spirit. The self is usually referred to as the Atman and the impersonal spirit of Brahman. Mircea Eliade, in his comprehensive study of Indian spiritual systems, writes about the Upanishad, one of the main spiritual texts. And Eliade says, quote, "The great discovery of the Upanishads was, of course, the systematic statements of the identity between the Atman and the Brahman. A common resolution of the contradiction between the perspective of the man of the world and the man of spirit that many people complacently live with is that human beings are persons who can sometimes experience eternity, universality, and impersonal spirit. These people usually take the view that they are the ego which sometimes surrenders to a larger or more universal reality. But according to the teachers who say that the true reality is impersonal and devoid of any hint of ego or personality, we are the impersonal and universal spirit or being, always and forever. Sometimes we take ourselves to be a person or an ego, but this is a transitory mistake. Some people accept these profound teachings as true, but unable to resolve this contradiction, continue to live a personal life. They believe it is somehow false in the hope of one day transcending it to the universal impersonal realm. And some actually do transcend the personal and the personal life, or so they say. This, however, does not resolve or eliminate the contradiction. Living the impersonal life of the universal truth is clearly possible, as has been demonstrated by some of the above quoted teachers. But this does not explain away the question of ego, the pursuit of personal happiness, and the belief in personal life. Transcending a situation is not necessarily the same as resolving it. So in other words, this sense of a few pages back when he talked about, if the ultimate view or the Atman or oneness is the privileged reality, why then do we have a self? Why is it even possible to be a self, to have a sense of personalness? Like if it's no matter whether or not, I think what he's saying is whether or not it's an illusion, that we take it as an illusion, or all the different views that you can have of it. If that's the reality, how come there's an ego at all? Is that like a mistake? Like, did God burp for a second and thus the whole universe shows up as God's kind of clumsy burp? Like, what's up with that? He goes on, we see that it is possible to live a transcendent, impersonal, and universal life. But what does this mean about being a human being? What is a human life then, from this perspective? Is it just a station? a meaningless gap full of suffering between our origin as the absolute reality and the final realization of the same reality? This is exactly the import of many of the teachings. But what an absurdity to think that we come from an absolute reality of impersonal truth, live a personal human life of suffering, and then go back to the same absolute reality. Of course, in the state of absolute impersonal transcendence, there is no concern and no question about the contradiction. The mind is silent. There is stupendous peace in wordless contentment. This is taken to be the answer by some teachers. There is no question. So no answer is needed. Still, this is not a true resolution. A true resolution must satisfy all parts of the human being, including the mind. A state of impersonal peace and stillness is not the answer. Whenever the mind is there, the question is there too. The answer, if there is one, must be at all levels and must satisfy all parts of the human being, even his logic, if it is going to be a complete answer, right? So we now he's starting to kind of like, tighten the noose here about this, about like what is like a true resolution, right, in the matter will be something integral and integrated and cohesive all the way through. And what he's basically saying from his view, that's not happening. He goes on, this is not to reject or devalue the truth of impersonality and universality. This truth remains the ultimate reality, the absolute nature of man and of all existence. Still, we are exploring human nature and human existence in order to understand human life in its true perspective. We put our inquiry so far in the form of a question. Is it possible to understand ego and personality in a way that gives a meaning to the orientation of most of humankind without contradicting the spiritual perspectives? I'll read that one again. I'm going to read that one again. Is it possible to understand ego and personality in a way that gives a meaning to the orientation of most of humankind without contradicting the spiritual perspectives? So in other words, is it possible that we can be a person and be an individual, right? And also be this universal ground, this oneness? Can those coexist in a completely harmonious way, right? In a way that totally makes sense? That's the question. The perspective of most spiritual teachings is that ego is a falsehood, and hence it must die for there to be truth. We will show that this is true, but that it is not the whole truth. We will show that the ego, with its sense of self and personality, has a truth hidden within its nature, a truth that is not necessarily visible from the transcendent and impersonal state. We will show that ego is a reflection of a truth, an attempt to imitate an absolute and eternal reality. In fact, we will explore how ego is nothing but a failed or aborted attempt at a real development. We will show that ego is a reflection, an imperfect one indeed, but still a reflection of true reality, the reality of the true human being. We will see that by understanding ego rather than transcending it, we can understand and actualize the reality of what it is to be a human being. Only through this understanding and realization can we see what human life is. Okay, this is worth another read. This is strikingly profound. We will show that the ego is a reflection of a truth, an attempt to imitate an absolute and eternal reality. In fact, we will explore how ego is nothing but a failed or aborted attempt at a real development. We will show that ego is a reflection of an imperfect one indeed, but still a reflection of true reality, the reality of the true human being. We will see that by understanding ego rather than transcend, we will see that by understanding ego rather than transcending it, we can understand and actualize the reality of what it is to be a human being. Only through this understanding and realization can we see what human life is. Okay, so what I hear him saying here is that this schism between the man of the world and the man of spirit, right? That the ego and the sense of the personal, right, reflects a real spiritual process going on. And although imperfect and contorted and malformed, that the fact, in other words, the fact that there is an ego, that there is a self, isn't a mistake. That there is a self reflects something going on ontologically that is actually true about that ontology, right? So what he's saying is that not abandoning the ego, not spiritually bypassing the ego, right? Rather understanding really what the ego actually is, what the self actually is, right? What he's saying is we may find that is grounded in something in being that is demonstrating the reality of being itself. And therefore understanding that, right, is understanding the self in this way, I think is what he's saying is it's not only not an illusion. To understand the ego and what it reflects is to understand being itself in a profound way. Okay, he goes on. We will see that this truth that ego tries to emulate is what most people are seeking in their personal life. And that realizing this truth of what it is to be a human being is the aim of humanity. I'm going to read that again. We will see that this truth that ego tries to emulate is what most people are seeking in their personal life. And that realizing this truth of what it is to be a human being is the aim of humanity. So what I hear here is that the thrust of the personal life is actually, what he's saying is trying to realize this truth of what it is to be a human being is the aim of humanity, right? That there's something about inherent in being a self is the understanding of the self that is simultaneously an understanding of being, and that there's something being reflected in this, right? That is in some sense, well, he says it right here, is the very aim of humanity. He goes on, humanity is in a sense astray, but there is a pattern to this way of existence which, when understood, reveals the true nature of the human being. Only this understanding will heal the schism and resolve the contradiction. The true human being, what we will call the personal essence, is the resolution of the contradiction. It is the integration of both points of view. From our point of view, the man of spirit has half the truth, and the man of the world has the other half, concealed behind a reflection that is taken to be the truth. In our exploration, we will discuss some of the eternal truths which are known in some of the spiritual traditions and are not revealed, but instead kept as precious secrets given only to those who genuinely seek. So I think what he's emphasizing here is that within, like, inquiring deeply into the reality of the personal self, right, is that it's not only is that personal self not separate from the ultimate ground of being, but the very fact of that there is a self is a real pattern that expresses being. And therefore, to deeply understand that, right, is to find and integrate being, right? So this unity between, the total synthesis between the man of the world and the man of the spirit is what I think he's pointing out. However, we will sometimes use the modern language of psychology and the findings of ego psychology and objects relations theory to convey these truths in a manner appropriate to our time. The approach we are giving here can be seen as radical from the above points of view. The personal essence, which is the subject of this book, is neither spiritual nor worldly. It is the true human being, the personal presence that is devoid of falsehood without being impersonal. I'm going to read that one again. The personal essence, in other words, that when we realize that personal essence is the resolution of this schism, right, is the subject of this book, is neither spiritual nor worldly, quote unquote. It is the true human being, the personal presence that is devoid of falsehood without being impersonal, right? So in other words, I think what I'm hearing him say is that it's possible that we can realize this personal essence, right? That the very realizing of it is a intimate connection with the impersonal. This, he goes on, this is not envisioned as possible by many spiritual teachings, although it is not the personality of ego. However, it is what makes the nature of ego and its concerns intelligible. An important consequence of the understanding of the personal essence is a new perception of life led by most people the perception of a spiritual truth or an essential element in the heart of all ego strivings. This means that, in fact, most of humankind are not astray in the usual sense of the word, but are after something real and precious. The difficulty lies in the fact that they do not know how to find it. Right? So it's like, in some sense, that the yearnings and the desires of the personal self or personal ego, right, is a I think what he's saying is this impersonal sense, but for the personal, for the personal self, right, to realize it isn't an erasing of that self, but in some sense it's realizing it, right? So it's kind of like you could say our understandings of the ego, right, when it with the schism is, it's like he's basically saying is the ego, it's the right yearning, it's just going to the wrong address. Essentially, it's looking at the wrong door, looking for love in all the wrong places. But the yearning itself, right, is right on and is part of reality, right? It's what's most real, I think, is what he's saying. He goes on, an important consequence of the understanding of the personal essence is a new perception of the life led by most people. The perception of a spiritual truth or an essential element in the heart of all ego strivings. This means that, in fact, most of humankind are not astray in the usual sense of the word, but are after something real and precious. The difficulty lies in the fact that they do not know how to find it. The qualities of the personal essence are those of fullness, autonomy, competence, respect, dignity, integrity, excellence, maturity, harmony, and completeness, amongst others. There is very little knowledge and guidance in the modern world about how to develop into such a true human being. The result is that most of us settle for an imitation or an incomplete development, which is the personality of ego. He goes on, understanding that ego is a reflection, or an imitation of a true reality makes it possible to connect to this reality. So in other words, the very schism itself, right, is the means that, if we understand it and we go into it, is the means of connecting, right, with what will heal the schism or resolve it. He goes on, one need not go the usual spiritual route of abandoning one's personal life and the values of that life, but rather one must look deeply into those values and explore the reality that they are approximating. Most people are not willing to abandon their personal life for a spiritual quest, not merely because of an attachment to ego, but because they sense a truth in the values and aspirations of personal life. For such people, the overwhelming majority of humankind, understanding the reality underneath the ego is a more accessible means of spiritual development than the traditional methods striving for impersonal reality. This is not only because in this method, they do not have to abandon their personal lives and aspirations, but also because that path reveals the deeper values and truths of those aspirations and strivings towards actualization, right? So, he's kind of really getting at that fundamentally, right? What motivates the values that drive, right, and give rise to the ego, right? That if we go deeper into these values, what we'll actually realize is that what it's desiring is the transcendence, but it can only realize the transcendence if it becomes the personal, the a true person. A true person is a requirement. It's not, it's a feature, it's not a bug, in other words. He goes on, the path of the personal essence not only brings about the development of the real human being, but also opens an easier way to the realization of the impersonal universal reality. The reason that realizing the life of the personal essence is a more accessible path for human beings than the realization of the absolute universal reality is that the ego is a reflection of the personal essence. And hence, ego can be used as a stepping stone towards it. The reason the realization of the personal essence makes entrance into the universal and impersonal realm much easier is that these realms are part of the natural and spontaneous development of the personal essence. Okay, so he's making this distinction, right? That's important, right? So he's making a distinction between the ego and the personal essence. Another way you can maybe imagine that is maybe the difference between the personality and the personal essence, right? That the ego with its distortions, right? The response to that isn't to get rid of the ego or abandon the ego, right? But it's to go deeper into the ego and realize its true nature. And its true nature, it's kind of, you could say, platonic form, if you will, right, is what he's referring to as the personal essence. That's what I understand. He goes on, the personal essence allows us to see the meaning and the potential of a fulfilled human and personal life, a life of truth, love, dignity, and harmony, which includes the usual human concerns of work, family, creativity, accomplishment, and enjoyments of all kind. One of the few teachers who has seen this possibility and given it its due importance is the Indian teacher and philosopher Sir Aurobindo, who was not satisfied with his transcendent and impersonal states of enlightenment, and who worked towards the actualization of a liberated human life. Writing about Sir Aurobindo and his work, one of his students says, quote, "It is not enough for us to find our individual center without the totality of the world, or the totality of the world without the individual, and yet less to find the supreme peace if it dissolves the world and the individual. I do not want to be sugar," exclaimed the great Ramakrishna. "I want to eat sugar." And without the individual, that meaning would all the marvelous realizations have for us, for we are no longer then. This book is an exploration of the personal essence, its nature, its relation to the ego and to the transcendent impersonal reality. Our method is the realization and development of the personal essence through the understanding of its reflection, the ego. The presence of ego points to the reality of the personal essence, just as the existence of false gold indicates the existence of true gold. Oops. All right, I think we'll end here. So I think we're starting to kind of get the drift of what we're up to with this and what we're going to be exploring. So one of the things I really appreciate about Almaas is in my experience, there are a lot of teachers and spiritual methodologies in schools that talk about some of this stuff, right? That talk about that the ego and the spirit, that they're actually there's a synthesis there, right? All the things that he's talking about. However, don't really go into the show how they're connected in a profound way, in a really deep way. Almost being a psychologist and an objects relation psychologist, his level of discernment and distinction in showing how, in a very, very precise way, distinguishes how it's connected, the way it's connected, right? And it in a very detailed, very rich way. That's what I really like about Almaas, is his rigor and his ultimately his philosophical his philosophical context has come from, right? His, Philia Sophia, his love of knowledge. So that's what we're up to with this reading. Thank you.